It's Halloween. It's raining. I wanted to film one more discussion of a movie, and just I just talked about my dog's gonna get scared by the thunder. I just talked about 10 horror movies, but I also wanted to talk about Enemy, which is hard to say it's a horror movie, really up until the last few seconds of the movie, where it is more clearly a horror movie. You could argue the whole thing is kind of a horror movie. But I'm transitioning now into talking about this series of 30 stories now. Last time I did a video, it was only 29. I just got a new prompt. I haven't started the new story yet, but 30 stories that I'm working on as part of this series called Opal Bean War. There's Bo on my lap, as always. Um, Hello, Bo. There's a couple of stories about cats, and I will talk about those later. But I have one that I'm working on called "My Lover is the King of Spiders." It was based on a prompt from A Winter's Tale. I had someone give me a prompt for a line from Winter's Tale, and it was about drinking a cup with a spider on it, and it has all of the subtext of infidelity and Winter's Tale. Winter's Tale is one of those really underrated plays, and I am not qualified to talk about it at all. Really, not a Shakespeare scholar, but it's really underrated story of. It's sort of like what if Othello had no reason at all to think Desdemona was committing adultery. Othello has Iago at least convincing him that Desdemona is committing adultery. What if Othello had nothing whatsoever? And so Enemy is a movie. It's Denis Villeneuve. Denis Villeneuve. I have no idea how to pronounce his name. He's a great director. He does these beautiful movies for sure. And Enemy is one of his earlier ones. It's from 2013. But I was sort of riffing on this notion. When I say riffing, I mean, just as I start a story, but there you go. As I start a story, I think about, what sort of stories give me kind of a model to think about, and maybe follow what sort of tone am I looking for. Maybe I'm riffing on A Winter's Tale. So I started riffing on A Winter's Tale and this line about spiders and infidelity, and it sort of just turned into riffing on Enemy instead. But Enemy is just a beautiful movie. It's one where it's very viscerally stimulating in that the tone of it, a lot of the really irrational elements, is what I was talking about in the last video, a lot of the really irrational elements like the visuals and all that really aid in the dark, intense horror tone of it, even though for most of the movie nothing really overtly horrific happens, but you have that sense that it's a horror story. And Enemy is almost a riff on Dostoevsky's The Double, where the Jake Gyllenhaal character, Adam and Anthony, they both have A's for names, which is probably a riff on Lacan. But Adam and Anthony are these doppelgangers, and they're sort of have this sort of intense back and forth having to do with infidelity. It's sort of a twisty plot. It's very simple, sort of a setup in the sense that it's not a whole lot of actors. It's Jake Gyllenhaal playing two characters with a very small number of other actors, but a lot of it is about suspicion of infidelity and what have you. But I'm going to talk about the very end. The very end. It's sort of a mystery about why they're doppelgangers. Why do they look exactly alike? Which is great, just irrational sort of a mystery, viscerally stimulating, that sort of idea that somebody else looks exactly like you. It has that sort of terrifying, in Us, recently. There goes the cockatiel. Yes, you liked Us? You think Us is better than Enemy? Two doppelganger stories. I love doppelganger stories, but yeah, Us and Enemy, very different movies. Yes, I agree. Very different movies, but they kind of are riffing on the doppelganger sort of idea. It is kind of terrifying to see someone with yourself. in Enemy, it really just deals more with like infidelity and stuff like that, and it's much more tonally kind of scary. But my favorite part of Enemy by far, is right at the end. I'm going to spoil the end. Jake Gyllenhaal's talking to his wife or his lover. I don't know. The whole relationship thing gets confusing. So just it's been a while since I watched it, so I can't quite remember exactly all the relationships. But he's talking to her. She goes into another room. He opens up the door, and there's a giant tarantula in there, which is irrational, and it has to do with the schematic breaking that I was talking about last episode. And I think that's kind of one of the keys in storytelling, in the sense that if you're watching a story and you have all these viscerally stimulating elements, one of the comforting elements is the schema, is the internal ordering system. And very frequently the schema is the story follows the rules of reality. So it quote unquote reality. If the story starts off following the rules of reality, and then you have some schematic break, where all of a sudden there's the intrusion of something that doesn't seem to fit in reality, or doesn't follow the schema, the rule system, the internal rule system of reality, it can have this unsettling effect. And it's a difficult thing to really handle all that well, because sometimes people can say they can identify that as a flaw, and they could say this is unrealistic, or they could say it had this sudden turn where there's this random spider. And the movie never explains where the spider comes from. Never is explicit in any way about what the spider is all about, what it means. And for me, that's the best part, by far, that they don't explain that spider at all. But the effect of it, the scare is rooted in that sort of schematic breaking of that sudden shift away from the expectations of reality. I would argue, and this is, it's a really tricky thing to handle no matter what, that sort of schematic breaking for an unsettling visceral effect, the discomforting of that sort of horrific, surreal, horrific shift. I would argue that it fails when it's a top-down, where it's a matter of inserting overt control, where it's something that is the author's trying to force the story to be. And it's just not working from that top-down authorial control perspective. That's where schematic breaking works, when it's bottom-up, when it's that guttural, visceral sort of imagery. And a giant spider suddenly showing up, if your aim is visceral stimulation, have a giant spider just randomly out of nowhere just pop into your movie and never explain it. And that's, really intensely visceral sort of image. But the tendency, from a writer's perspective, totally valid to have a spider show up and not explain it. From a critic's perspective, they'll say that spider. Here's what the spider means. The spider is a manifestation of so-and-so's paranoia about his wife's infidelity or something like that. That's totally valid from a critic's perspective, but the mechanism that the writer would recognize in that sort of scene is that by limiting the expectation, here's the visceral effect that would happen. If you make the metaphor too easy, that can limit the visceral effect, because the metaphor of here's what the spider means. If you make that too easy, that undercuts the visceral stimulation, and that's a tool you can work with for sure, to get the right balance. As I said, getting the right balance. And I don't mean even balance. I mean, Enemy is a movie that's not about balancing things with, on the one hand, you have this set amount of logical explanation. On the other hand, you have this set amount of absurd plot shifts and things like that. You're not weighing those two against each other. Right balance means you elicit the most effective visceral effect. So that can mean extreme visceral imagery. That can mean, holding back on the visceral imagery. And, making the ease with which you can explain something with a metaphor can be a tool that you can use to really temper that visceral effect, so that, maybe it's too irrational. Maybe that will short circuit the audience's ability to process that visceral effect. and that will undermine the visceral effect. It goes too far in the irrationality. Let me temper it a bit by making the metaphor a little bit easier. So from a writer's perspective, it's a tool that you use to get a good balance on the rationality and the visceral effect. But from a critic's perspective, the goal is to say, here's something that doesn't make sense. Let me explain it. So very different sort of a function there. But anyway, Enemy by Denis Villeneuve. I don't know how to pronounce his name, sorry. See you on the next episode.